She had learned, somewhere between raising children and burying a husband, that the most honest conversations happen when hands are busy. Helen Torres was 79 years old, and she had been making tamales every December for 63 of those years. She'd learned from her mother, who'd learned from her mother, who'd brought the tradition from Mexico to Texas in 1920 with nothing but recipes and hope. The process was labor-intensive, soaking corn husks, preparing masa, seasoning meat, assembling each tamale by hand, but Helen had never considered skipping it. Some traditions weren't optional. They were the thread that held everything together. This particular Saturday morning in mid-December, Helen stood at her kitchen counter in her small house in San Antonio, her hands working through masa with the muscle memory of decades. The kitchen smelled like cumin and chili powder and the particular steam that came from corn husks soaking in warm water. Outside, the temperature had dropped to the low 40s, cold for South Texas, and the sky was that flat gray that suggested rain without quite delivering it. Her kitchen table was covered with ingredients and equipment, bowls of shredded pork, bowls of masa, stacks of softened corn husks, twine for tying, everything organized with the precision of someone who'd done this hundreds of times. She worked alone. That was new. For most of her life, tamale making had been a family affair. Her daughters would come over, and later her granddaughters, and they'd spend the whole day together, talking, laughing, complaining about the tedious work, eating the ones that broke during assembly. The kitchen would be full of voices and hands and the particular chaos of women working together toward a shared goal. But this year, no one had offered to help. Her daughters had their own plans, work parties, their husbands' family obligations, last-minute shopping. Her granddaughters were busy with college finals, holiday events, their own lives that didn't include standing in a kitchen for 8 hours making food they could buy frozen at H-E-B. Helen understood. People got busy. Priorities shifted. You couldn't expect younger generations to maintain every tradition exactly as it had been. But understanding didn't make the empty kitchen feel less empty. She'd raised 4 daughters in this house. Maria, the oldest, now 52 and living 20 minutes away with her husband and 3 teenagers. Carmen, 50, divorced, working 2 jobs to support her son. Rosa, 47, married to a man Helen had never quite warmed to, but who treated Rosa well enough. And Lucia, the youngest at 43, recently remarried after a difficult first marriage, trying for a baby with her new husband, despite doctors saying the odds weren't good at her age. Helen loved them all fiercely, but lately, and she hated admitting this even to herself, she felt like she was losing them. Not in any dramatic way, just in the slow accumulation of missed calls and canceled plans and conversations that stayed on the surface instead of diving deep. They still came for Sunday dinners, most weeks, still called on her birthday, still included her in major events, but something had shifted. They were polite rather than present, dutiful rather than engaged. They asked about her health and her garden and whether she needed anything from the store, but they didn't ask about her life, her thoughts, her feelings about getting older and being alone and watching the family she'd built drift into separate orbits. Helen spread masa across a corn husk, added pork, folded it with practiced efficiency. Her hands knew what to do even when her mind was elsewhere. She thought about last Christmas, how the dinner she'd spent 2 days preparing had been rushed through because everyone had other places to be, how her gifts, carefully chosen, wrapped with ribbon she'd saved from last year because why waste good ribbon, had been opened quickly and thanked for politely and probably forgotten by New Year's. She told herself it was fine, that she was being overly sensitive, that this was just how modern families functioned, busy, scattered, connected more by obligation than genuine desire to be together. But then, 3 weeks ago, she'd overheard something that settled into her chest like a stone. She'd been at Maria's house, dropping off some alterations she'd done for her granddaughter's homecoming dress. Maria wasn't home, but the front door was unlocked, as it has always been when someone is expected, so Helen let herself in. She was heading to Maria's sewing room to leave the dress when she heard voices in the kitchen. Maria and Carmen having coffee, talking. Helen should have announced herself immediately, but something in their tone, intimate and unguarded, made her pause. "I just don't know if I can do another holiday at Mom's house," Carmen said. "It's the same every year, the same food, the same stories, the same expectations. I'm exhausted just thinking about it." "I know," Maria's voice, tired. "But what are we supposed to do? She'd be devastated if we didn't come." "Would she? Or would she just guilt us about it later?" "Carmen, I'm serious. When's the last time we did something for the holidays that wasn't exactly what Mom's wanted? Her house, her menu, her schedule. We're all in our 40s and 50s, and we're still just performing for her." There was a pause. Helen stood frozen in the hallway. "That's not fair," Maria said, finally, but her voice lacked conviction. "She's alone. She's all she has. That's not our fault. She chose to stay in that house. She chose not to date after Dad died. She chose to build her whole life around us. And now we're supposed to, keep that going forever? I don't know. I feel guilty." "Me too, but I'm tired. Aren't you tired?" Helen left quietly, put the dress back in her car, drove home with hands that shook and a heart that felt too large for her chest. She hadn't mentioned it to Maria or Carmen, hadn't confronted them, hadn't even let on that she knew, but she couldn't unknow it, couldn't unhear the weariness in their voices, the resentment, the suggestion that her presence in their lives had become a burden rather than a gift. Helen finished another tamale and set it in the steamer basket. Her hands moved automatically, freeing her mind to turn the problem over. She tried to examine it honestly, without defensiveness. Were her daughters right? Had she made them the center of her life in a way that had become suffocating? After her husband died 15 years ago, she'd certainly leaned on them more. They'd encouraged it at first, calling daily, stopping by frequently, making sure she wasn't lonely. But maybe that temporary support had calcified into permanent expectation. She thought about the holidays. Carmen was right that they always followed Helen's preferences, her house, her menu, her traditions, but no one had ever suggested doing it differently. No one had volunteered to host or proposed new traditions. Helen had simply continued doing what she'd always done, assuming that's what everyone wanted. Maybe they'd been too polite to say otherwise. Maybe she'd been too insistent to hear it if they had. The rain finally started, light and steady against the kitchen windows. Helen washed her hands and made herself a cup of coffee. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd fed babies and helped with homework and played cards with her husband on Friday nights, and forced herself to think about what came next. She could confront her daughters, tell them what she'd overheard and demand an explanation, but that felt small, petty, like forcing an apology that wouldn't change anything. She could pull back, stop hosting holidays, stop calling, stop being the one who held everything together, see if they noticed, see if they cared. But that felt like punishment. And Helen had learned over 79 years that punishment rarely produced the results you actually wanted. The truth was harder and simpler. Her daughters were exhausted. Not because of anything she'd done wrong necessarily, but because life was exhausting. Work and marriages and children and bills and aging parents and all the invisible labor of being a woman in the world. They loved her, she believed that, but they didn't have unlimited capacity for maintaining relationships that required constant tending. And Helen, without meaning to, had become one more thing that required tending. She remembered her own mother in the years before she died, how Helen had felt that same exhaustion, the obligation of Sunday visits, the predictability of her mother's complaints and stories, the guilt of wanting to spend time with her own children instead of sitting in her mother's living room listening to the same anecdotes about people who'd been dead for 30 years. She loved her mother, but she also felt relieved when the visits ended, when the phone stopped ringing with requests for rides to the doctor or help with bills or just company because loneliness was unbearable. Helen had judged herself harshly for that relief, but maybe it had just been human. Maybe there was only so much emotional labor any person could sustain before something had to give. The question was, what could she give her daughters that didn't require more from them? The tamales took all day, as they always did. By evening, Helen had made 64 tamales, enough to give each daughter a dozen, with some left over for herself. She packaged them carefully in containers labeled with each daughter's name, added reheating instructions, and set them in the refrigerator. Then she sat down at her kitchen table with a notepad and began to write. Not a guilt trip, not a confrontation, just some thoughts that needed recording. She wrote about traditions and how they evolved, about the difference between obligation and desire, about how love sometimes meant releasing people from expectations they never agreed to carry. She wrote about her own loneliness and how it wasn't her daughter's job to fix it. She wrote about getting older and having to rebuild a life that no longer revolved around being needed. She didn't plan to send what she was writing to anyone. It was just for her, a way of thinking through what she understood and what she didn't, a way of being honest with herself about what needed to change. By the time she finished, it was late. She was tired in that deep way that comes from both physical labor and emotional excavation, but something had loosened in her chest, some knot of expectation she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. Sunday dinner came, as it always did. Maria arrived with her family. Rosa came with her husband. Lucia came alone. Her husband was traveling for work. Carmen sent a text. Working late, sorry, next week for sure. Helen served the meal she'd prepared, chicken enchiladas, rice, beans, salad, the foods everyone had grown up with. Conversation flowed around the table, polite and surface level. Her granddaughters talked about school and friends. Her sons-in-law talked about football. Her daughters managed the meal, passing dishes, refilling drinks, the choreography of family dinner. Helen participated, but also observed. She noticed how her daughters checked their phones between courses, how the conversation never went deeper than schedules and logistics, how everyone seemed to be performing the ritual of family dinner without actually being fully present for it. After the meal, as people were preparing to leave, Helen handed out the tamales, 1 container per family, labeled and ready. "Mom, these are amazing, thank you," Maria said, as she always did. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble," Rosa added, as she always did. The responses were familiar, automatic, kind, but not particularly meaningful. Helen smiled and accepted their thanks, but she didn't mention that she'd spent the entire day alone making them, didn't mention that it would have been nice to have help, didn't say anything that might sound like guilt or obligation. After everyone left, she sat in her quiet living room and thought about what she'd learned. Her daughters loved her, but they were also tired, and she could either resent them for that tiredness or she could adapt to it. Adaptation seemed wiser. The next morning, Helen did something she hadn't done in 15 years. She joined something that had nothing to do with her family. The senior center 3 blocks from her house offered activities she'd always dismissed as not for her: chair yoga, book club, art classes, volunteer opportunities. She'd driven past the building hundreds of times without considering that it might have something to offer. But Monday morning she walked in. The woman at the front desk, middle-aged, warm smile, name tag reading Paula, greeted her enthusiastically. "First time here? Welcome. Let me show you around." The center was busier than Helen expected. Older adults everywhere, some playing cards, some doing crafts, some just talking over coffee. The noise was pleasant. The energy was gentle but alive. "We have lots of options," Paula explained, walking Helen through the various rooms. "What interests you?" Helen almost said she didn't know, but then she thought about her empty kitchen and her idle hands and said, "Do you have cooking classes?" "We do, and actually," Paula's face lit up, "we have a community kitchen where volunteers teach traditional recipes to anyone interested. We're always looking for more teachers. Do you cook?" "I make tamales." "Perfect! We'd love to have you teach. People are always asking about tamales." Helen hesitated. Teaching meant commitment, meant showing up regularly, meant building something new instead of just maintaining something old. "I'd like that," she heard herself say. The first class was scheduled for the following Saturday. Helen arrived early, nervous in a way she hadn't been nervous in years. She'd brought all her equipment, her ingredients, handwritten instruction sheets she'd made the night before. 8 people signed up. Most were women around her age, but there was also a younger woman, maybe 40, and an older man who said his wife had always made tamales and he wanted to learn now that she was gone. Helen showed them each step: how to prepare the masa, how to spread it on the husks, how to fold and tie. She moved around the table, correcting techniques, answering questions, sharing the small tricks her mother had taught her. Something unexpected happened. She enjoyed it. Not because it replaced her daughters or filled the void of family, but because it was purpose without obligation. These people had chosen to be here. They wanted to learn. Their presence was voluntary, not dutiful. During the class, a woman named Betty asked, "Do you do this with your family?" "I used to," said Helen, "but everyone's busy now. Life changes." Betty nodded knowingly. "My kids don't want to learn my recipes either. They say they'll just look everything up on YouTube when they need it." She laughed without bitterness. "I figure if I teach enough other people, maybe the recipes survive anyway." Helen had never thought about it that way, about legacy as something broader than direct descent, about passing things on to anyone willing to receive them, not just blood relatives who might not want the gift. "That's wise," said Helen. "That's survival," Betty replied. Helen continued teaching, once a month at first, then twice a month when demand increased. She taught tamales and enchiladas and pozole and all the dishes her mother had taught her. She taught people who'd never met her daughters and didn't care about Helen's family dynamics, who showed up because they wanted to learn, not because they felt they should. She also started attending other activities at the center, joined the book club, even though she hadn't read for pleasure in years, started going to chair yoga, even though she felt ridiculous at first, volunteered to help with the community garden. She made friends, not deep friendships immediately, those took time, but friendly faces, people who knew her name, who asked about her week, who invited her to join them for coffee after activities. It wasn't the same as family, but it was community, and community, Helen discovered, was its own form of nourishment. Christmas approached. Helen called a family meeting, something she'd never done before. All 4 daughters gathered at her house on a weeknight, confused but present. Helen had prepared coffee and pan dulce. She waited until everyone was settled at the kitchen table before speaking. "I want to talk about the holidays," she began, "and I want you to listen without interrupting, okay?" Her daughters exchanged glances, concerned, defensive already. "I know I've been," Helen chose her words carefully, "I've been holding on to traditions very tightly, making them requirements instead of invitations, and I think that's made holidays feel like obligations to you instead of celebrations." "Mom," Maria started. "Let me finish, please." Helen's voice was gentle but firm. "I overheard you and Carmen talking a few weeks ago about being tired, about holidays feeling like performances, and I need you to know I'm not angry about that. I understand it. I felt the same way about my own mother sometimes." The daughters looked at each other, guilt and relief mixing on their faces. "So here's what I'm proposing. No more mandatory gatherings at my house, no expectations that you'll show up just because that's what we've always done. If you want to come to Sunday dinner, come. If you don't, don't. I won't be hurt." "Mom, we want to come," Rosa began. "Maybe, sometimes, but not every week, not out of guilt." Helen leaned forward. "I've been building my life around being your mother for so long that I forgot to build anything else, and that's not fair to me or to you. So I'm building other things. I'm teaching classes, I'm making friends, I'm living a life that doesn't revolve around whether you call or visit." Lucia had tears in her eyes. "We love you." "I know you do, and I love you. But love doesn't mean you're responsible for my happiness. That's my job." Helen smiled. "I've been putting that on you without realizing it, and I'm stopping." Carmen, the one who'd been most frustrated in the overheard conversation, spoke quietly. "Does this mean you don't want us to come for Christmas?" "It means I want you to come if you want to come, if it brings you joy, not just obligation. If it doesn't, if you'd rather spend Christmas with your in-laws or your friends or just at home in your pajamas, that's okay too. I'll still love you. You'll still love me. We'll figure out other ways to connect." "But you'll be alone on Christmas," Maria said, her voice breaking slightly. "Maybe, or maybe I'll spend it with the people from the senior center who also don't have family plans. Either way, I'll be okay. I promise." The daughters sat in silence, processing. Finally, Maria said, "Can we still come? Not because we have to, but because we want to?" "Of course." "And can we maybe change some things, try some new traditions, make it less about recreating the past and more about who we are now?" Helen felt something warm expand in her chest. "I'd like that very much." Christmas came. All 4 daughters came to Helen's house along with their families, but this year was different. Carmen brought a ham instead of expecting Helen to cook everything. Rosa brought side dishes. Lucia brought dessert. Maria organized the kids to set the table and clean up afterwards. They played games after dinner instead of rushing off to other obligations. They laughed more, talked more honestly, let some of the old formality dissolve into something easier and more real. When everyone left, Helen's house was messier than usual, dishes still in the sink, wrapping paper not quite cleaned up, evidence of life lived rather than performance executed. She stood in her kitchen and felt something she hadn't felt in years: fullness without exhaustion, connection without depletion, love without obligation. It was enough. It was more than enough. The years continued. Helen kept teaching at the senior center. Her classes became popular enough that she started leading them weekly. She taught people from all over San Antonio: immigrants wanting to learn traditional Mexican cooking, young professionals interested in learning from scratch, older adults trying to preserve fading skills. She became known in the community, not as someone's mother or grandmother, but as Helen, the woman who taught cooking, the woman with patient hands and clear instructions and stories that made the tedious work feel meaningful. Her daughters visited less frequently than they had before, but the visits were better, more genuine. They talked about real things: struggles at work, difficulties in marriages, fears about aging. Helen listened more and advised less, asked questions instead of offering solutions, held space for their complexities instead of trying to fix them. She discovered that releasing control actually deepened relationships, that letting people come to her freely created more authentic connection than demanding their presence ever had. Her granddaughters started asking to learn cooking, not out of obligation but genuine interest. They'd come over on random Saturdays, just them and Helen, and she'd teach them one recipe at a time. The teaching happened in comfortable silence, punctuated with questions and laughter, and the kind of ease that comes when no one is performing. Betty from the senior center became a real friend. They'd have coffee every Thursday morning and talk about everything: children and grandchildren and aging and loneliness, and how to build meaning when the roles you'd played your whole life no longer fit. "You know what I've learned?" Betty said one morning. "We spend the first half of life building a family, and the second half learning that family is bigger than biology." Helen nodded. She'd learned that too. On a Saturday in December, 5 years after that difficult conversation with her daughters, Helen stood in her kitchen making tamales. But this time she wasn't alone. 3 women from her cooking class asked if they could come learn the full traditional process, the all-day commitment, the authentic way. They worked alongside Helen, their hands learning the motions, their questions filling the comfortable silence. Around noon, Maria stopped by unannounced. She stood in the doorway watching the scene, her mother teaching, the women learning, everyone's hands busy and everyone's faces relaxed. "Mom, Maria paused. "I just wanted to say thank you." "For what?" "For teaching us that letting go is also a form of love." Helen looked at her oldest daughter, saw the gray in her hair, the lines around her eyes, the evidence of her own aging and her own life lived. "You taught me that," Helen said. "You just didn't know you were teaching it." Maria smiled, helped herself to coffee, sat at the kitchen table and watched for a while before eventually joining in, her hands learning alongside the strangers who would carry these traditions into their own families, their own futures. And Helen, 79 years old and still learning, felt that fullness again, that sense of purpose that didn't require anyone else to complete it, that love that gave without demanding return. She spread masa on a corn husk, added filling, folded it with practiced grace. Her hands were older now, more weathered. The arthritis made the work harder than it used to be, but they were still capable, still creating, still offering what they had to give to anyone willing to receive it. That was the gift of aging, she'd discovered. Not wisdom in some grand abstract sense, but the simple understanding that you could keep growing, keep adapting, keep finding new ways to matter, even when the old ways no longer worked. You could release what needed releasing without losing what needed keeping. You could love people without requiring them to love you back in the exact way you'd once needed. You could build a life that had room for loneliness and room for connection, room for tradition and room for change, room for who you'd been and who you were still becoming. Helen tied off the tamale and set it in the steamer. Outside, the December sky was gray and promising rain. Inside, her kitchen was full of hands and voices and the particular steam that comes from corn husks and warm water and shared labor. She had learned somewhere between raising children and losing a husband and rebuilding a life from quieter materials that the most honest conversations happen when hands are busy. But she'd also learned that honesty meant silence, meant letting go, meant trusting that love would find its way through whatever form it needed to take. And in the learning, she'd found something unexpected, not just wisdom, but peace, the kind that doesn't depend on anyone else giving it to you, the kind you build yourself, one small choice at a time, one released expectation at a time, one open hand at a time. It was enough. It had always been enough. She just hadn't known how to see it yet.